just do this a little different this week. And normally, like I said, we've had a common way of doing it, but it's an opportunity to really kind of examine, our hearts and how we worship. The Bible, the word worship, the English word, appears in the Bible 197 times. Of those times, there are 118 times in the Old Testament, and 11 different words are used in the Old Testament where we translated it, Hebrew words, translated it to the word worship. And in the New Testament, it was 79 times. And actually the reverse, 11 Greek words is the New Testament, and that was 11 and 7 in the other one. Of that, though, there were two words, one Hebrew, one Greek, that 75% of the time, that's the word that they use. And there's variations, but every one of them focuses on how we act and how we respond and how we live as it relates to God. And the two words, the Hebrew and the Greek, both the ones that most often use, are translated to this idea of bowing down, of lying prostrate, of bowing in adoration to God. I say that because we often, if someone was to ask you about worship, you might think, well, I went to the worship service and we sang and we shook hands and we gave an offering and we heard a message and we think of the things that we do. But the reality is, you don't have to be a Christian to do those things. You can be an atheist and come in here and you can listen to me talk, whether you like it or not. You can give an offering, you can shake hands. Everything we do here, anybody can do. So that in and of itself is worship. Worship takes place, like I mentioned before, when there's an impact into the heart, when there's a relationship that exists. The idea of worship is the idea of communing with God, where we are communicating with Him and He is communicating with us. And there's this relationship that takes place between us and God as we communicate together. John Wimber, in a book called Thoughts of Worship, described 5 phases, and I wanted to kind of understand this because Scott's going to come up in a minute and talk about the worship through the music part of it. But it's important to understand, because what we talk about in the mechanics of some of the things, really the question is the motives in our own heart and where do we see ourselves in that. And so he describes these 5 phases that exist, that happen. And I should say this, because this has been about what does the Bible say, and it's very much that here now. But other than the passage I mentioned to you in John 4, which is Jesus said, true worshipers worship in spirit and truth, there aren't any verses that specifically say, no one said to Jesus, teach us how to worship, like He does teach us how to pray. But in those 197 times, you look around that and you begin to see what's happening, and you see God's reaction to the worship of His people, good and bad. And you begin to understand that there is something that's taking place in the context of that worship. And these phases that he describes here, which are in your insert that are listed, are those things that help express that. And so there was the call to worship, which is that idea of communicating with God or to us, or being invited into God's presence to be able to lift up worship on Him. And then there's verses that are referenced in there, so I'm not going to go through all the verses today. But then the engagement is this idea that you begin to connect with God and with each other. There's this corporate connection of, I loved what I read on one a book. I think it was Tim Keller, which was, he's a pastor and kind of a modern day theologian. And he says, worship and community is like when you have like the Clydesdale horses harnessed together, and that they're going forward, as opposed to individually we're moving, but you bring together. And so worship corporately is engaging in God, where you're beginning to lift up those songs of praises. You're beginning to connect with God in your worship. And then there's that expression of that yourself, where you're becoming awakened to God's presence. Sometimes it's a sense of disharmony, where you realize, wow, you know what? I know that I'm not right with Him, or you're trying to be able to really, God's showing you stuff about yourself. And so that third one is kind of an expression of that worship that comes out. The fourth one is visitation, which is this idea of that the Almighty God visits His people. Where Jesus said, in some of the verses that you have there, where 2 or more are gathered, I'm there. It's the presence of God. Psalm 22 talks about God inhabits the praises of His people. There's one translation, or enthrones Himself in the praises of His people. This idea that God is present in our worship and in the elements of what we do, and where you feel, that sometimes you talk about the emotion and stuff, but But the reaction of people is you sense the Spirit at work in your life and the presence of God being at work. And then the fifth one is this response of generosity, giving of substance, and we'll talk more about that as well. But understanding that, it's seeing how, again, Tim Keller, I loved a comment that he made. He says, it is a process of becoming aware of God's worth and then giving to God what He's worth in ourselves. And that's kind of what takes place as we kind of go into this. Think about in your own, as you engage in these things, do I sing? Yeah, but more importantly, are these things happening in me as God's Spirit is working in me and I'm worshiping Him? And so I'm going to invite Scott up right now to be able to talk a little bit on his part of it.
All right. There was a question that was asked about why in worship do we sometimes feel compelled to lift our hands? Which actually is an interesting question and raises other questions about really why do we do anything that we do in worship? Not just maybe lifting our hands, but why would we feel compelled to respond at all to God in worship? Why do we sing? Why do we clap our hands? Why do we dance? Oh wait, I forgot we're Christian Reformed. We don't dance. Maybe a better question is, why would the Bible talk about dancing in worship? And why would the Bible talk about things like shouting to God, etc.? All these questions get raised up, and they're all great questions. First of all, we need to understand that just because we do any of those things doesn't necessarily make it worship. And that's important to understand first and foremost. Just because we lift our hands or clap our hands or sing or dance or shout doesn't necessarily make it worship. You can sing and not necessarily worship. You can lift your hands and not necessarily worship. Worship is about taking whatever we do and intentionally directing it to God. Does that make sense? Worship is about taking whatever we do and intentionally directing it to God. It's about choosing to honor Him through whatever we are doing and whatever we're saying. So we've talked before about how, as Paul describes it in Romans chapter 12, our lives can really become a sacrifice of worship to God. Like our whole life can be this sacrifice of worship to God as we choose to honor Him through everything that we do and say. However, there is this biblical and historic practice of coming together as a community of believers and worshiping God through singing, dancing, clapping, shouting, kneeling, lifting our hands, etc. Okay, but we have to make a distinction. It isn't just these actions that make something worship. It's the motive and the heart behind, and really it's not just these things. It's anything that we do that can really become worship to God as we dedicate it and direct it Him. So the question posed is, why do we feel compelled to do these things? Why do we feel compelled to lift our hands? I guess there are two ways that question could be taken, and I'm not sure which way the person who asked it meant it. I'm not sure if they were asking because they sometimes feel compelled to lift their hands in worship, or if they're watching everybody else who's lifting their hands and going, why in the world are these people so compelled to do this? I guess either way, I suppose the answer is the same to the question. So let me take a stab at this. It's perhaps the answer to this question is perhaps somewhat of an abstract answer, in that it may not totally make sense to you until you experience it firsthand, until you actually kind of go through that experience. When we worship, as we talked about, we intentionally focus our attention on God, and we begin to dwell on His character and His nature and His attributes. And when we begin to sense then the greatness and the majesty of who God really is, and how broken and sinful and wretched we are in comparison to God, it can be a bit of an overwhelming experience.